Um, all right, well, welcome everyone, and hopefully more of you might pop in while I say uninteresting things. We're very happy to have you in spite of the elements, in spite of everything that's going on in everyone's life, which is, well, at the moment, pretty much nothing, um, for a digital Oriel Talks. Now, we're hoping that this is the only time we'll ever have to do this, but it's worked out pretty well, and we're really happy to be able to give that platform today to our three wonderful speakers. Now, the thread of world orders that our three speakers are going to explore are a little different, but the idea was to allow you to travel places that you might not be able to go to at the moment or ever for some of those. So we'll begin with a physical journey to the at the heart of the Israel-Palestine conflict with Neil Misra, who will talk about the various complex interest relationships between the players, and in particular the role of certain interest groups that might not be expected that arise from the very complex geopolitical landscape over there. We'll then move to a very different world, a way more spiritual world, and try and conquer a little bits and pieces of that world and see if some of our physical attributes can be discussed in spiritual terms with Matt Collier, who will discuss the masculinity or otherwise of God. And then we're really delighted to have Suzanne Chiodo as our keynote speaker. So Susie will discuss the various elements of and recent developments in the history of collective litigation from a transatlantic perspective, and with an eye on the not so recent Canadian developments and extremely recent and ongoing progress on the British side of the pond. So thank you very much to all of you for being here. And it is my greater pleasure to make time for my notes to pop up and then introduce Neil Misra. So Neil Andrew Misra, I'm still buying time, as you can tell. So we all know Neil Misra. He was an Oriolensis between 2017 and 2018, and is now one of our associate members while serving as the graduate vice president of the Oxford University Student Union. He studied in modern South Asian studies at Oriel, and before that had the extremely disgraceful, made the disgraceful decision to study at the other place for a thing we won't even say. Anyway, he worked in various places of power. He studies international relations. He's been an intern at the US House of Representatives, at the Embassy of Jordan in Washington, DC, and was appointed as a delegate to the United Nations ECOSOC Youth Summit. Without further ado, it is our greatest pleasure to welcome Neil Misra.
Thank you, Mr. Jesse, for that lovely introduction. As Jesse already so eloquently said, hello, I'm Neil. I'm your SU Vice President for Graduates, and I also did a Master's in Modern South Asian Studies here at the Oriel College, and it's great to be speaking to the greatest college here in Oxford. So my talk today is going to be about the secret partnership between Israel and Saudi Arabia, and also various other Gulf states that are sort of behind the scenes. Now you might say, Neil, I thought these countries hated each other. And it's definitely true that they don't have any sort of diplomatic relations with each other, nor have they ever had any form of diplomatic relations with each other at any point of their history. However, things have definitely changed in recent years. From the Israeli side, the Israeli Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, said in a joint press conference alongside President Trump, for the first time in my lifetime, and for the first time in the life of my country, Arab countries in the region do not see Israel as an enemy, but increasingly as an ally. And from the Saudi side, billionaire Prince Walid said before his house arrest, Saudi Arabian and Israeli interests are almost parallel. So you might be thinking, what the heck is going on here? Well, I'm going to explain what's going on, and I'm going to divide my explanation into three constituent parts. First, I'm going to talk about the historical context, what the situation has been up until recently. Secondly, I'm going to talk about what has changed. Why have these enemies become friends? The big question of why. And I'm also going to talk a little bit about how the secret partnership manifests itself in material terms and sort of the operational aspects. And lastly, I'm going to talk about the implications for the Palestinians, because I think that's a really interesting question. Could this detente benefit the Palestinian cause at all in any tangible sort of way? And also whether there's any hope for, a formal normalization of relations rather than just being all sneaky behind the scenes. So I'm going to kick off with part one, the sort of historical context. And as I stated before, Israel and Saudi Arabia don't have diplomatic relations. They never had any form of formal relations in their entire history. And the key issue there has been the Palestinian conflict. The Palestinian conflict has always been a wedge in formal relations between the two countries. However, in spite of this key dividing issue, there have been various overtures made at various points throughout history to sort of ameliorate the situation a little bit. Firstly, there was the Fahd Plan in 1981, introduced by the Saudi Crown Prince Fahd. And Prince Fahd's eponymous plan sought to give Israel recognition in exchange for a full withdrawal from the occupied Palestinian territories that were seized during the course of the 1967 war. Surprise, surprise, the plan did not work. Secondly, there was the Madrid and Oslo peace processes of the 1990s, after which the Saudi government, along with the GCC, the Gulf Cooperation Council, ended its secondary and tertiary boycott of companies that are doing business with Israel. But again, surprise, surprise, this didn't result in any sort of meaningful long-term normalization of relations. And lastly, you had the Arab Peace Initiative, or API for short, which was a plan that was introduced by the Arab League in 2002, largely with the Saudis taking the lead on that one. And what it offered was full recognition of Israel in exchange for a full Israeli withdrawal from all occupied Palestinian territories. So in this definition, that includes the West Bank, it includes the Gaza Strip, and it also includes East Jerusalem. Now, this whole scheme was the brainchild of the late Saudi king Abdullah, who was crown prince at the time. And he managed to secure unanimous approval of the whole Arab League for this plan, which you couldn't say the same for the aforementioned Fahd plan of 1981. Now, there are definitely some cynics out there who are skeptical of this whole plan, but Sir Tom Phillips, who was at one time the British ambassador to Israel, and also at one time the British ambassador to Saudi Arabia, said this wasn't just a way for the Saudis or the Arabs to score political points with Washington, D.C. after 9/11. No, he says the plan showed a genuine Saudi willingness to accept Israel in some sort of formal capacity. However, you might have noticed a recurring theme here. That plan also failed, did not yield any sort of concrete progress. So in summary, for part one, there's no diplomatic formal relations, and every attempt to fix that has failed. However, something changed in roughly the last decade and a half, and Israel and Saudi Arabia have started becoming more buddy-buddy with each other, and we're going to talk about why that shift happened in part two. So, moving on to part two, why Israel and Saudi Arabia have developed this secret strategic relationship. So in part one, we saw that Israel and Saudi Arabia haven't been able to establish any sort of formal ties in spite of making many efforts to do so. And this is principally due to the Palestinian issue. But in recent years, there has been a thawing of relations between the two countries. They've forged cozier ties behind back doors. And though there's no explicit open cooperation between the two countries, it has become a little bit of an open secret that Israel and Saudi Arabia are covertly cooperating behind the scenes. Why is this happening? Why this change? Well, in one word, Iran. Iran. If you remember one thing from this talk today, just remember Iran. Now, that's a little bit simplistic, so let's disaggregate that a little bit. I would argue that there are three fundamental factors that are driving the Israeli-Saudi covert relationship. One, the perceived Iranian nuclear threat. Two, the perceived threat of Iranian encirclement by Iran's proxies. And three, the perceived threat of US disengagement from the region, the Middle East region. So perceived threat number one, the nuclear threat, both countries consider the Iranian nuclear program to pose a grave existential threat. I won't engage in this talk as to whether this perceived threat is actually credible. Israel already has a secret nuclear arsenal of their own. And so from the Iranian perspective, they could argue that Israel is the real threat and Iran is merely acting in a defensive manner. But anyways, both countries consider the Iranian nuclear program to be a serious threat and have held secret meetings to talk about dealing with this shared threat. So why are both countries concerned about the Iranian nuclear program? Well, from the Israeli perspective, that's a very interesting answer. The Ayatollah has said that Israel must be destroyed and has also proclaimed that there will be no Israel in 25 years. And the commander-in-chief of the Islamic Republic of Iran army boasted that we will annihilate Israel for sure. And from the Saudi perspective, it is widely believed in Riyadh, just as it is in Jerusalem, that Iran strives for the total obliteration of the Saudi state. The Saudi foreign minister has plainly said, Iran seeks the destruction of Saudi Arabia. There are lots of rivalries that are sort of underwriting this sort of animosity between Saudi Arabia and Iran. But principally you could talk about, the Sunni Shia divide. You could talk about Arab versus Persian. You could talk about conservative monarchies versus revolutionary states. Who gets to claim the leadership mantle over the Islamic world? But we're not going to unpack all of that in this talk because that could be its own talk or its own book even. It's also worth noting that members of the Saudi royal family, like Prince Turki Al Faisal, have openly alluded to the notion that, if Iran gets its own nukes, we want our own. We're going to get our own as well. And there's a BBC investigation that has highlighted that apparently that there are Pakistani nukes that are, quote, ready to ship at a moment's notice if need be. So needless to say, both countries consider the Iranian nuclear program to be an existential threat. Both countries also hate the Iran nuclear deal. They're very hostile to the 2015 Iran nuclear deal. They think that, like North Korea, Iran can't be trusted to be adhering to any sort of serious nuclear deal. Major General Yaakov Ahmadror of the IDF said of the deal, "This is a threat to our existence and will not allow it to happen." And from the Saudi viewpoint, an anonymous diplomat source leaked that the Saudis are furious about the Iranian nuclear deal and are willing to give Israel all the help that it needs. Luckily for them, our good friends, the Donalds, pulled out of the 2015 nuclear deal. So I'm sure they're quite happy with that. So moving on to perceived threat number 2 that's driving these once hostile states closer together, the encirclement threat. Both these countries are scared that Iran is funding or supporting, sponsoring various enemies or subversive elements in the region. And more specifically, both states feel threatened by a perceived encirclement by Iranian proxies, Iranian agents, and Iranian allies. They accuse Iran of using sectarianism to interfere in Arab countries and build its own sphere of influence in the countries and territories that flank Israel and Saudi Arabia through exploiting various Shiite Muslim groups that stretch from Iran all the way to Lebanon. So in terms of the various perspectives from both sides, from the Saudi side, they are concerned that Iran is in cahoots with the Houthi rebels in Yemen, along their southern border. They're concerned that Iran is, funding the Houthi separatists. Syria is also a concern for them. Saudi's foreign minister criticized Iran for propping up the corrupt government of Syrian President Bashir Assad. And to a lesser extent, the Saudis are also concerned about Iranian influence in Iraq and Bahrain. So they're concerned, all around. And from the Israeli side, they're concerned about Iranian support for Hezbollah and Lebanon to the north. They're concerned about Iranian support for Hamas in the West Bank to the west. They're concerned about Syria, especially alongside the Golan Heights in that general area. So to sum up, both Israel and Saudi have expressed concerns of encirclement by various Iranian proxies and allies. And the third and final perceived threat that is driving these countries together is the perceived threat of American abdication. So both countries think that America has forgotten about them, specifically during the Obama administration. America was traditionally viewed as a leader in providing security in the Middle Eastern region, but President Obama's pivot to Asia is considered to be indicative of a greater trend of US disengagements from the Middle East region. In both Riyadh and Jerusalem, it is widely believed that the Near East holds a declining level of importance within the American security establishment, and that both states fear the US reneging on its obligation to act as a sort of regional leader. All of these problems are even further compounded by Obama's perceived accommodation of the big bad devil, Iran, especially through the aforementioned 2015 nuclear deal. So it's really during the Obama administration that you see this covert partnership really start to materialize, really start to coalesce. So, thanks, Obama. Fortunately, our good friend Donald Trump has somewhat reversed course since the Obama administration, so things have changed since then. But in terms of the covert partnership between the two countries, Obama kind of really did inadvertently help lay the foundation for the partnership. So just to sum up, because of these three factors, the Iranian nuclear deal, encirclement by Iranian proxies, the perceived abdication of the US from the region, these once mortal foes have started warming up to each other and cozying up to each other. And these factors have culminated in the two countries forming a sort of covert partnership, mainly to collaborate on containing Iranian influence. So how have Israel and Saudi Arabia been cooperating? Well, there have been secret meetings between intelligence officials and government leaders from both countries, which are often officially denied. There have also been some coordination of military plans drawn up to deal with the Iran issue. Allegedly, there have been some contingency plans in place to conduct airstrikes if necessary. Saudi has allegedly given the Israeli military authorization, secretly of course, to use Saudi airspace in order to conduct airstrikes against Iranian nuclear facilities if it ever came down to that. And an anonymous diplomat even leaked that the Saudis would be willing to potentially cooperate over the use of rescue helicopters, over tanker planes, over drones, in order to assist in such an Israeli raid into Saudi Arabia. And lastly, there have been some sharing of weapons technology. Israel allegedly offered Saudi Arabia and other Gulf states access to its coveted Iron Dome missile defense technology system. Israel has sold hundreds of millions of dollars worth of military technology to the Gulf states. And another big thing is that Israel did not kick up a big fuss when the Saudis and the American government signed the gigantic $110 billion arms deal with President Trump. Now, this stands in massive contrast to when during the Reagan administration, the US and Saudis also signed a big arms deal, but the pro-Israeli lobby in the US kicked up a massive fuss, a very aggressive campaign against that. But now you can see there is all sorts of extensive military strategic cooperation between the two countries, which is a big historic change, and it's primarily driven by the three aforementioned factors. So now we're going to go on to the final section of the talk, part 3. What are the implications for the Palestinian issue and for the normalization of relations? So just a little refresher. Like I said, these two countries have been hostile towards each other, but now they have a shared enemy in Iran, so it's an enemy of my enemy is my friend kind of situation, and they've improved relations. Does that mean that there is any chance of progress on the Palestinian peace front? And would this result in a better relationship? And also, could this relationship lead to any sort of formal, official, out in the open kind of ties between Israel and Saudi Arabia? My assessment in one word is no. The answer is no. There is, of course, plenty of scope to cooperate behind the scenes, but it's very clear that in order to have official, open, formal diplomatic relations, there needs to be a peace deal for the Palestinian peace process. And the peace deal probably has to be in line with the conditions stipulated in the aforementioned Arab Peace Initiative Plan of 2002 that I talked about in the introduction, which means, you know, Israel's got to go back to 1967 borders, and they got to give a two-state solution. There has to be a two-state solution. Without a Palestinian peace deal, there is absolutely no scope for any sort of open formal relationship. It would antagonize too many actors in the Middle East and go against Saudi principles to recognize Israel before any sort of peace deal has been created. Is there any chance of a Palestinian peace deal anytime soon? Now, that question could be enough content for 1,000 Oriel Talks, but also, in a word, no, extremely unlikely that there will be any sort of meaningful peace deal anytime soon. And if anything, it seems momentum is going backwards in the opposite direction. So even though there is robust cooperation going on between the Gulf Arabs and the Israeli, there's very little hope for the Palestinians. There's very little material benefit for them. It's unlikely that any sort of covert reconciliation will yield any sort of material, tangible benefit for the Palestinians or for the Palestinian peace process. And frankly, there's very, very little incentive for both countries to immediately formalize their relations or make a big push on the Palestinian peace front. Both countries are more or less already getting what they want, which is a strategic partnership to contain Iran. Moreover, for Israel, the bigger priority is retaining control over the Palestinian situation. That's a much bigger priority than normalizing relations with Saudi Arabia. And on the Saudi side, much of the Saudi population and much of the Arab world remains virulently anti-Israel. And this is a big reason why the relationship between the two countries has to be more behind the scenes, has to be behind closed doors. There are probably more than a couple Saudi citizens that would be unhappy if they saw that their government was openly and brazenly collaborating with Israel, a country that is still widely perceived to be a destabilizing threat in the region from their perspective. Excuse me. So consequently, the Saudis are in no rush to openly normalizing relations. The issue of Iran is a far more immediate concern than making meaningful progress on the Palestinian peace process or normalizing. So that's more or less it. So just to sum up everything we've talked about today, Israel and Saudi historically have not maintained any sort of formal bilateral relations. There have been several attempts to improve relations in the past, but they've never been particularly successful. This all changed with about the last decade and a half, when both countries started to thaw relations because of their shared animosity towards Iran. And in particular, the things that drove the two countries closer together are a shared hostility towards the Iranian nuclear program, shared threats of perceived encirclement by various Iranian proxies and allies, and lastly, the perception that America is just giving up, piecing out, abdicating its role as a security leader in the Middle East region, particularly during the Obama administration, and particularly with the signing of the Iran nuclear deal in 2015. All these factors have led to a tightening of relations between Israel and Saudi Arabia, and they've cooperated covertly on security and military matters as a result. However, it is very unlikely that this thawing of relations between the two countries will lead to any sort of progress on the Palestinian peace process, and as a direct result, this thawing will not result in the formal normalization of relations between the two countries. It's going to stay top secret. That's basically it, and I'll hand it back to the floor, back to Jesse and Mr. Spate. Thank you, guys.
Well, so we're very, very sorry. Neil, you've been naughty and have completely run out of time for questions. We do have to stick to schedule. There will be other opportunities for you to be grilled on everything you've said about Israelia, but in order to allow the other non-naughty people to have their time, we are going to have to move forward on schedule.
I apologize.
You're not excused.
Okay, great. Yeah, thanks, Neil. Thanks. So our next speaker for this evening is Matthew Collier. Mr. Collier is currently reading for the DPhil in philosophy under the guiding hand of Professor Gonzalo Rodriguez Pereira. Before this, he read for his MA in philosophy at the University of Aberdeen, and then for the DPhil in philosophy at Oriel under the supervision of Professor Brian Lefto, from whom he gained much philosophical and theological inspiration. He enjoys cricket, croquet, lawn bowls, and all things English, and it seems all things that require a meticulously prepared grassy surface. He will now speak to us on the topic of Is God Masculine? Over to you, Collier.
That was extremely kind and very accurate with the English comments. Anyway, right, I'm going to absolutely whistle through to try and stay on time. Also, I need to go to the lavatory, so I also really have an interest in getting this through very quickly. Okay, so Michael Rear argues for the falsity of genderism, the view that gender is a divine attribute and that God belongs unequally to both genders. So I'm going to make some distinctions. For simplicity, Rear talks as if sex and gender are binary categories and as if sex is not socially constructed, whereas gender might be. Here I focus on gender. Now, there are two things we might mean when we claim that, we make a claim that, that sort of gendered or has a gendered characterization. The first is denominated strongly gendered and the second weakly gendered. On the first, we might have in mind that gendered characterizations involve gendered pronouns or predicates whose applications or extensions can literally only be applied to or range over members of one exclusive gender. On the second, we might have in mind gendered characterizations that involve gender stereotypical predications of persons, despite the fact that members of both genders can be literally predicated therewith. Now, for the Imago Dei doctrine. Man and woman are made equally in God's image. Rea understands the equality thesis to be the following. All human beings are created equally in the image of God, and if mental and behavioral characteristics contribute at all to gender membership, then the ones that contribute to making someone a woman are no more or less relevant to her bearing the image of God than those that contribute to making someone a man. Now on to the argument against genderism. First, for every divine attribute, like say omniscience, either it is essential or it is contingent, which means either God cannot fail to have that attribute or he can fail to have that attribute. And either it is intrinsic or it is extrinsic, which means it is either in God in a sense or it is external to him in a sense. So every divine attribute is either 1, essential intrinsic, 2, essential extrinsic, 3, contingent intrinsic, or 4, contingent extrinsic. So we have the argument. Premise 1. Strongly gendered attributes are among God's essential attributes only if God belongs equally to both genders. Premise 2. The category of contingent intrinsic divine attributes is empty. There are no contingent intrinsic divine attributes. Premise 3. Strongly gendered attributes are among God's contingent extrinsic attributes only if God belongs equally to both genders. Now, Rea argues if 1 to 3 true, then genderism is false. I shall only focus on premise 1. Strongly gendered attributes are among God's essential attributes only if God belongs equally to both genders. The first part of a defense of premise 1, Rea argues, is a defense of the claim that no divine person of the Trinity has essentially a strongly gendered attribute unless all persons of the Trinity are masculine and feminine to the same extent. Rea contends that this claim is supported in 2 ways, both of which rely upon perfect being theology, underpropped by the assumption that no gender is better than the other. Rea admits that the Imago Dei doctrine is crucial since it theologically underprops this assumption. So the first way, plausibly, if an attribute A is essential to all persons of the Trinity, then intrinsically it is better to be A than not to be A. Since this principle holds for non-strongly gendered attributes, it ought to hold equally for strongly gendered attributes. However, being one gender is no better than being the other. Therefore, unless all persons of the Trinity are both genders to the same extent, having a strongly gendered attribute is not essential to each person of the Trinity. Rea's second way is as follows. Through perfect being theology, the method employed to determine which divine attributes are essential and which are contingent is to distinguish between the great-making properties and the non-great-making properties, where the set of all of the essential divine attributes will correspond to the set of all the jointly possible great-making properties. A great-making property is something that would make something greater, like, say, omnipotence. However, given the assumption that being a member of one gender is no better than being a member of the other gender, the strongly gendered attributes of one gender are great-making properties only if the strongly gendered attributes of the other gender are equally great-making properties. Thus, a fortiori, strongly gendered attributes of one gender are members of the set of all jointly possible great-making properties only if strongly gendered attributes of the other gender are also members of that set. Rea then argues that at least one Trinitarian person is essentially of one gender only if at least one Trinitarian person is essentially of the other gender. Since imagine that every Trinitarian person were, say, masculine. If masculinity and femininity are both great-making properties, then had every Trinitarian person been feminine, God would have been no worse. However, in this scenario, God's set of properties would not correspond to the greatest set of jointly possible great-making properties. But this is against the view that God is the greatest possible being. To avert such a conclusion, it is necessary that one claim in the following triad is true. A, at least one person of the Trinity is masculine, whereas at least one other is feminine. B, all persons of the Trinity are both masculine and feminine. Or C, no person of the Trinity is either masculine or feminine. But if, say, two persons of the Trinity were of one gender and the other were of the other, then would God be no more of the former gender than the latter? Rare says no. First, the claim of the form God is more F than G is true only if every person of the Trinity is more F than G. B, the divine nature is more F than G. Or C, the Trinity as a whole is more F than G. Now, in cases where F and G stand for masculine and feminine, Rare thinks that options A and B will be denied by the Imago Dei doctrine. In support of this, Rare argues, if every person of the Trinity were more masculine than feminine, or if the divine nature were more masculine than feminine, men and women would clearly not be equally created as such in the image of God. Men, as such, would be greater image bearers than women. Moreover, Rare argues that C will only be satisfied under the condition that F and G are shared by all persons of the Trinity. He says, for after all, we don't say, for example, that God is more discarnate than incarnate, less distinct from Father and Son than identical to Father or Son, etc. But we've already established that if all three persons of the Trinity are masculine, all are equally feminine and vice versa. Thus, on the supposition that two members of the Trinity are essentially masculine and one is essentially feminine, it is still not the case that God is more masculine than feminine. And second, Rare argues, in claiming that God is more of one gender than the other, under the conditions that two persons of the Trinity are members of one and the other person is a member of the other, one claims that terms of the former gender more appropriately describe who God really is than terms of the latter gender. However, making such a claim commits oneself to a kind of subordination view, such that the person of the Trinity who is the other gender is deemed less really God compared with the two other persons. Rare goes on, if every person of the Trinity were more masculine than feminine, men and women as such would not be equally created in the image of God. Men would be greater image bearers than women. Thus, Rare believes that premise one is true. Premise one being strongly gendered attributes are among God's essential attributes only if God belongs equally to both genders. The problem, however, with this argument is, and these arguments in general, is that they admit of reductio ad absurdum arguments, and here is why. Let us assume that the following is true. If every person of the Trinity were more masculine than feminine, men and women as such would not be created equally in the image of God. Men would be greater image bearers than women. That is, let us assume that the Imago Dei doctrine and the equality thesis provide the theological underpinnings of the claim that no gender is better than the other. If this is true, then we should be able to swap the attributes masculine and feminine for other attributes, say mentally disabled and mentally abled. I now parody Rere's paper by swapping the terms around. First, some distinctions, and here I just follow the structure of Rere's argument. First, some distinctions. For simplicity, I shall talk as if mental disability and mental ability are binary categories, and as if cognitive impairment, or a lack thereof, is not socially constructed, whereas mental disability or ability might be. There are two things we might mean when we claim that a characterization of someone is put in mental ability or disability terms. The first I denominate strongly mentally disabled or able terms, and the second, weakly mentally disabled or able terms. On the first, we might have in mind that mentally disabled or able characterizations involve mentally disabled or able predicates whose applications or extensions can literally only be applied or range over members of one exclusive mental ability. On the second, we might have in mind that mentally disabled or abled characterizations involve predicating of persons' stereotypical mental disability or ability properties, despite the fact that members of both mental abilities can literally be predicated therewith. I shall understand the equality thesis to be equivalent to the following claim. All human beings are created equally in the image of God, and if cognitive and behavioral characteristics contribute at all to mental ability membership, then the ones that contribute to making someone mentally abled are no more or less relevant to that person's bearing the image of God than those that contribute to making someone mentally disabled. Lastly, mentally disabledism, or abledism, it's a horrible word, but is the view that being mentally disabled or abled is a divine attribute, and that God belongs unequally to both the mentally disabled and the mentally able. So now on to the argument. Premise 1 star. And this is just exactly the same argument, but switching around the terms from masculine and feminine to mentally able to mentally disabled. Premise 1 star. Strongly mentally disabled or abled attributes are among God's essential attributes only if God belongs equally to both the mentally disabled and the mentally abled. Premise 2. The category of contingent intrinsic divine attributes is empty. Premise 3. Strongly mentally disabled or abled attributes are among God's contingent extrinsic attributes only if God belongs equally to both the mentally disabled and the mentally abled. Now, if those three are true, then mentally disabledism or mentally abledism is false. The first part of my defense of premise 1 star is a defense of the claim that no divine person of the Trinity has essentially a strongly mentally disabled or abled attribute, unless all persons of the Trinity are mentally disabled and mentally abled to the same extent. I contend that this claim is supported in two ways, both of which rely upon perfect being theology, underpropped by the assumption that being mentally abled is no better than being mentally disabled. I admit that the Imago Dei doctrine is crucial since it theologically underprops the assumption that being mentally abled is no better than being mentally disabled. The first way runs as follows. Plausibly, if an attribute A is essential to all persons of the Trinity, then intrinsically it is better to be A than not to be A. Since this principle holds for non-strongly mentally abled or disabled attributes, it ought to hold equally for strongly mentally abled or disabled attributes. However, being mentally disabled is no better than being mentally abled. Therefore, unless all persons of the Trinity are of both mental abilities to the same extent, having a mental disability or ability attribute is not essential to each person of the Trinity. The second way runs as follows. Through perfect being theology, the method employed to determine which divine attributes are essential and which are contingent is to distinguish between the great-making properties and the non-great-making properties, where the set of essential divine attributes will correspond to the set of all the jointly possible great-making properties. However, given the assumption that being mentally disabled is no better than being mentally abled, mentally disabled attributes are great-making properties only if mentally abled attributes are equally great-making properties. Thus, a fortiori, mentally disabled attributes are members of the set of all jointly possible great-making properties only if mentally abled attributes are also members of the same set. So both of these arguments don't seem right. If Rea is right in the case of gender, then Rea is committed to the view that either God is equally mentally abled and mentally disabled, or being mentally disabled or abled is not a divine attribute. But clearly, God is undoubtedly mentally able. So there's a major problem there. So the problem is, to avoid the conclusion that, that's the problem, but the issue is, to avoid the conclusion that God is equally mentally disabled and abled, or is neither, Rea is committed to saying that the mentally disabled are not made in the image of God to the same extent as the mentally able. But we shouldn't wish to say this. We should wish to say that the mentally abled and mentally disabled are made equally in the image of God. But in order to avoid the problem here of saying that God is, is neither mentally able or mentally disabled, or is both equally, he has to then do something like the claim the mentally disabled are worse divine image bearers than the mentally abled, and we shouldn't wish to say this. So something has gone wrong in Rea's argument. Before I finish, though, I'll note one thing of theological interest, if you're wondering where on earth the theological interest lay. Rea writes that the motivation for using masculine terms for God is undercut if the metaphysics of God suggests that he is not really a he. By metaphysics of God, I just mean, he actually is intrinsically a he. I think this doesn't follow. For example, say we had a student who is feminine, but wanted to be characterized in masculine terms. does the fact that the student is metaphysically feminine undercut our motivation for referring to the student in masculine terms? I don't think so. If we ought to pay the student the courtesy of referring to him as a him, ought we to pay this kind of courtesy to God if God wants us to refer to him as a him, even if perhaps the metaphysics of God suggest otherwise? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Matthew. We have the time for one question, so please raise your hands away.
Oh, sorry, it's slow.
There you are. So there's a raise your hand function on the participants tab, which I don't think anyone has used.
Marie's waving a blue hand.
Yeah, Murray?
Very hand-wavy comment, I'm sure.
Hello. Well, yeah, I just have a question that might somehow follow up with your conclusion. You said that referring to God as masculine was somehow a matter of abiding by respect to what can be found in the scriptures, etc. I was wondering what you made of the feminine images of God, whether in Psalms or in the Gospel. So when there are references to the bowels of mercy, which is the rachim or the splachnon in Greek, or when Jesus says that he would have loved to shelter Jerusalem like a hen keeps her babies under her wings. And another element that, well, I don't know if you'd have the time to develop on that point a bit more. It would have to do with the hypostatic union and whether we could somehow infer that if Jesus is masculine, the verb is not necessarily more masculine or more feminine. So that would be whether you have the time to dwell on this a bit or not.
Yeah, sure. So, yeah, wonderful. Okay, so I'm going to get the last one first. So Rhea makes it very clear that that sort of it wouldn't necessarily work that just because one member of the Trinity had a certain property that we should say that all members of the Godhead, for instance, or we should say that on balance the Trinity is more F than G. For instance, we don't want to say that the Godhead or all members of the Godhead or just the divine nature is more incarnate than disincarnate. So that's the first point there, and onto the stuff to do with scripture, and also Julian of Norwich, for instance. One wonderful lady, actually. I think she's the first lady, I think, to write substantial amount in English rather than in Latin. Anyway, it often refers to God in sort of feminine terms. Now, yes, this is true, but my point here is not that God is masculine. It's simply conditional. So the point I made at the end, saying that just because the metaphysics of God are such and such, does not undercut our reasons for referring to him in, say, masculine terms, if he wanted us to. Now, the if he wanted us to, of course, is the really interesting stuff for theologians. And of course, the scripture often, as is their wont, is slightly unclear on this. And so that's where fantastic theology has to happen. Another point you made, what was it? I can't remember. I think that was the two, wasn't it? I think that was two, Marie.
Yeah, that was pretty much it. It was just, well, the Splachnon would refer to the idea that God has a uterus, but indeed one could not limitate the capacity of God, and given that he has created men and women in his image, maybe the female part.
So yeah, this is.
I see how it works together. So thank you for explaining this.
Yeah. So that point there's that sort of fascinating, because often we talk about things like sort of Mother Nature, and also interesting things. So Aquinas thinks that women are sort of demi men in a way, because they don't provide the sort of the impetus, the sort of the seed, the thing from which stuff flows. He thinks that they're just a sort of incubator, and the sort of the male assumes the role of providing the kind of life force that which is then sustained by the woman. So yeah.
Well, we have no more time for questions, but thank you very much, Matthew, for your talk.
Anyone's welcome to message me afterwards or whatever. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Matthew. Yeah. It's my pleasure now to welcome our keynote speaker for this evening, Suzanne Chiodo, although I believe it's actually early afternoon for her currently. Suzanne is a stipendiary lecturer in law at Oriel and commenced the DPhil in law in October 2017. Before beginning her doctorate, Suzanne was a class actions lawyer at Roche en Genova LLP in Toronto. She completed her LLM in December 2016. Her book, The Class Actions Controversy, published in October 2018, and winner of the 2019 Peter Oliver Prize in Canadian Legal History, arose from her LLM thesis on the history of the Ontario Class Proceedings Act. She has presented papers to the Ontario Bar Association and the Ontario Human Rights Commission, and has published numerous papers on class actions and tort law. So once I make her a host, we'll hear from Suzanne. 1 second. Right, I believe you should be able to share your screen now.
Okay, and I think I'm unmuted as well. So,
yeah.
Yes, good. Hi, everyone. It's really good to see all the Oriel crowd and a few additional people as well. So thank you for coming today. And excellent talks. Sorry, Neil, that I didn't applaud your talk. I couldn't find the little logo until the end of Matthew's talk, but they were both excellent. So I'm going to get on with mine. So because then presumably you have to get to dinner somewhere, if not in hall. So let me share my screen. Let's see if this works. So you should now be seeing my PowerPoint slides. And now I can't see you. So if, let's see if I can fix that. I now have a sidebar. Great. So I can see some of you. I can't see all of you because I have to see my slides as well. So I'm talking today on a big part of my DPhil research, which is on collective litigation in England and Canada. And collective litigation is sort of a catch-all term for a number of different procedures that I'm going to talk about in this presentation. So let's get on with some terminology, because the terminology is quite nuanced, and one of the reasons that class actions have arisen in Canada before they did in England is because people were confused about the terminology. So I'll run you through that first, and then we can get on with how collective litigation has evolved in each of the countries. Okay, so first of all, we have representative action. Representative actions are where one person brings a legal action on behalf of a group of people. And generally, they're bound together by some kind of pre-existing identity. So it's a trade union or a residents association or some other group that is identified as the group. And usually the rights that they're asserting through the litigation are group rights. They're communal rights. So it's an indivisible group. Then we move on to the class action. And by class action, I mean the modern day kind of class action that you find in the US or in Canada, where you have one person suing on behalf of a group of people, but it's not a representative action because the group is bound together by the issues that are at the heart of the litigation. So the thing that the defendant allegedly did wrong, you know, a defective pharmaceutical drug or a defective product or some kind of mass accident or something like that, that's what binds the group together. And they don't have any pre-existing identity. They're just a group of random people who are affected by the conduct of the defendant. That's a class action. And then the third procedure is group litigation, which has been formalized in England in the last 20 years. And group litigation is where you get lots of people suing on their own account. So everyone brings their own lawsuit, but all those actions are grouped together in one case management form in one court. So you have lots of, maybe 1,000 different lawsuits, but they're all grouped together by a judge so that she can manage them all together. And so group litigation is much more individualized. So let me represent that with some pictures. So the rest of the presentation I put together in advance, but this one I put together just this morning because I really wanted to symbolize the differences between these three procedures, because that's key to the history of collective litigation in both countries. So a representative action is on your left there, I believe. So that's a big diamond. That is one big indivisible diamond. The identity is the diamond. It can't be divided out into lots of little diamonds without changing its identity. It is a big diamond, the end. And then you get group litigation, which is smaller diamonds, but they're still sizable. You could still sell each of them for a decent amount. It's not like they have their own sort of little identity and their own value in themselves. But you might be able to hold them in your hand. So you might be able to collect them all together. And then we have class actions. Sorry, someone isn't muted, so I can hear someone. It's a bit distracting.
I'm going to sit down couch where we've had so many.
Lola, I think it's you.
Tell you that I am Mr. Heaps. I wish you were here.
Okay, I can hear Lola, but I'm going to talk over her because it sounds like she's on some personal phone call. Okay, and then you have class actions where it's the diamonds are so small they can't stand on their own. They're not worth anything on their own. It's not really worth their individual value is negligible. So it's almost as small as sand, right? And so you have to group them together to get anything done because they can't stand on their own. And so that's really the classic distinction between the three procedures. Representative is the identity of the group. A class action is lots of people sort of collected together, but they're, individually, they couldn't bring their own action. And then a group litigation is where the lawsuits can stand on their own, but they might be they might be managed together just for convenience's sake. If you can maybe take that.
Susie, sorry. I'm not the host currently, so I can't mute whoever it is, but if you want to, I think you should be able to. Sorry to butt in.
I don't know if I have to. How do I see everyone so I can? Okay, just 1 second. There you are. She's muted, so I don't know who it is. In fact, everyone is muted, so I guess the problem's, Marie's not. Let's mute Marie. Right, I don't know if it was her, and Aidan's not. Right, this is great, I have the power. Okay. Great, let's see if that's
Sorry to butt in.
No, it's fine. Okay, so if you can maintain that distinction between the three procedures, then you're already doing better than the Supreme Court of Canada and actually most people who've written any literature on this area. I've been studying this area for 5 years, and I've never seen that distinction put like that anywhere in the literature. And that distinction is key to the problems that collective litigation has run into in England and in Canada. Okay. So let's move on then to representative actions. And I'm going to start running through how they've evolved in England and in Canada. So a representative action, like I said, it's the group identity. And so they evolved originally in the courts of equity. So common law and equity were historically administered in separate courts. So two separate ways of doing law, and they were in two separate courts historically. And the lawyers are going to be yawning at this point because it's old news to them. But for a generalist audience, this is an important distinction. So if you had a problem and the common law provided no remedy, then you would take your case to equity and lean on equity for justice to be done. And so common law took a narrow view of what we call the joinder rule, when you join people to a suit. So I'm suing and I want to bring in my husband and my dad and my brother. I would join them to the suit. That's joinder. And so common law said, well, unless the individual's consent or their immediate interests are affected, you can't bring them into the litigation. so they took quite a narrow view. Whereas equity said, well, you know, if the eventual result is going to affect them, then we think you should bring them in. And so they're, you know, they're a bit more flexible in that regard. And so, and then it got to the point where they said, well, if everyone's going to be affected by this result, you should bring in everyone. You have to bring in everyone. And then the next step was, well, what happens if we can't find everyone? You know, that's, if there's 1,000 people out there, what if we can't find them all? And then what happened is they said, well, you can have one person and they will represent everyone else. And so that's really how the representative action came about. There's an issue and dispute that affects a big group of people. Not all of them can be found, so one is allowed to represent them. And the condition was that all these people had to have what's called the same interest in the action. They all had to be equally affected by what's happening in the proceeding. And so traditionally, this was on behalf of groups, people who already had an identity that pre-existed the litigation. So parishioners of a parish, tenants in a village, trade unions, that kind of thing. And it was usually for a declaration of rights. Let's see. It was usually for a declaration of rights. So, for example, do we have the right as tenants on this manorial land to graze our cows? We want a declaration that says that. So then you would bring a representative action. And then the court would say, well, yeah, you do. And then that affects everyone similarly, right? So everyone has that right, if they're a tenant, to graze their cow on the manorial lord's land. That's an archetypal representative action. So the rights are held in common, and the relief is also held in common. The relief affects everyone the same way. Then in the late 19th century, you get what's called the fusion of the courts of common law and equity. And so they became, the procedures remained the same, but there was a fusion of the courts. And so the representative action became available in the common law courts. And the new rule read that where there are numerous parties having the same interest in one action, one or more such parties may sue or be sued on behalf of or for the benefit of all parties so interested. And so the emphasis is on this same interest. Do they all have the same interest in the action? And that became key in the evolution of the representative action rule. So what does same interest mean? Well, the courts held that the same interest required a common interest, a common grievance, and relief beneficial to all. So you have a common interest in what the lawsuit is about, and you have a common interest in the relief. The relief affects everyone the same. So just like when you're grazing your cow on the land, everyone has a right to do that. That's the relief that's beneficial to all. And so like I said, the archetypal representative action fairly easily met that requirement because you have these pre-existing groups and the relief is exactly the same for every member of the group. And that's what happened in the Ellis case, which involved a bunch of people who sold vegetables at the Covent Garden Market, and they all had the same interest in the property interest in selling the vegetables at the market. But it was much harder for that requirement or those requirements to be fulfilled by groups that didn't have a pre-existing identity or were seeking damages that might differ. So I'm talking monetary damages that might differ amongst individual members of the group. So you have the Marked case where you have a load of people who have no idea of the existence of the other. They've no pre-existing connection. They all just happen to have individual contracts with this one shipper, and they put their stuff on the ship. The ship sails from Russia to Japan or something like that. And the Russian authorities destroyed the ship because it says it's got contraband on it. And all these people who had these contracts go to the shipper and say, we want our money back. You know, you didn't tell us that our stuff was going to get sunk to the bottom of the ocean. And the court said, well, you can't do that in a representative action. First of all, you all have different contracts with the defendant, and you're all claiming different damages, and some of you might not have any damages at all. You know, if you actually were shipping contraband, which probably should have got shot down, right? So there was too much difference within the group to have it as a representative action. And that decision, marked, has kind of decided the course of the representative action up until the present day in England. In Canada, it's a bit of a different picture. So in Canada, around the beginning of the 1970s, the courts start interpreting the same interest test much more liberally. They don't say, well, you know, if you've got differences between class members, or if you've if you're not a pre-existing group, you can't bring a representative action. They start saying, well, you know, what is the same interest, really? Let's see what it actually means. Maybe it just means same interest in the outcome of the action. And of course, if you're going to put the same interest test that way, pretty much every group could meet it, because everyone wants to win the action, unless they have, you know, conflicting interests or something. But so they start expanding the same interest test that way. They also say, well, it doesn't matter too much, does it, if you've got individual damages, because what we can do is decide the liability questions. Did the defendant do something wrong first? And then afterwards, you can all just claim your individual damages in another proceeding. So they sort of split, they bifurcate the proceeding that way and say, well, so you can have a representative action just for this question that affects the whole group. And so that's what happens in cases like Chastain and Shaw in British Columbia. British Columbia sort of leads the way. And then Quebec sees this, and Quebec is a very sort of progressive jurisdiction at this point. It's the 1970s. We've just had the 60s. We've just had lots of social justice type movement in America and the United States with desegregation and things like that. So Quebec is looking south of the border and going, well, we want to be a bit like that. And we also see that all these other provinces have this representative action, and they're interpreting it really liberally. But we can't have that. Now, why can't Quebec have that? Because it's a civil law jurisdiction. And this is another distinction that I don't want to confuse you with, but civil law is different from the common law. They have different traditions and different ways of approaching the law. And so because Quebec was a civil law jurisdiction, they didn't have this representative action. But they wanted to be like America. They wanted to be, as it was then, progressive. They wanted to bring about more justice for people like consumers and things like that. So they said, well, all the other provinces have it. America has it. Let's have class actions. And so because they don't have the rule, they pass a statute. They pass legislation saying you can have class actions. And it's very influenced by the US. And so they have formal ways where you can claim as a group for damages. You don't have to have the same contracts. You don't have to have the same damages. You don't have to have what the traditional requirements of the representative action are. So really, Quebec is the first jurisdiction in Canada to have modern day class actions legislation. And then Ontario starts looking at Quebec and at America and starts thinking, oh, we kind of want to be like them too. And they start interpreting their representative action rule more liberally and saying, well, you know, it doesn't matter if there are individual issues or individual contracts, you can still have a representative action. And so we've got this movement across Canada where they're starting to relax the traditional restrictions on representative actions so that the modern day groups that don't have a pre-existing identity and have different issues between them, but they can still bring representative actions. And then we get to the early 1980s, and there's one of these cases to do with GM, General Motors vehicles, gets to the Supreme Court of Canada. And the Supreme Court looks at this case, which is called Nakin, and looks at this case and says, hang on a minute. You're trying to fit this really simple representative action rule, and you saw the wording earlier. It's like 30 words. You're trying to fit into this representative action rule a really complex modern day procedure that affects lots of different people and affects some people even though they don't know they're being affected by it, right? Because everyone who's been affected is included unless they decide not to be. So you've got all these people whose right to being affected, and it's governed by the simple rule, and the court basically says, whoa, whoa, whoa. The representative action rule is completely unsuitable for this. It's really only for groups that have a cohesive identity, and you vehicle owners who are claiming a certain amount of money and damages each don't have that identity. So you can't bring a representative action. And so then this happened in Ontario, and then in various provinces following that judgment, they made the same decisions. So we have in Newfoundland, there's a bankruptcy that affects 22,000 people in Newfoundland, and they've all lost lots of money, but they can't bring a representative action because they've all lost different amounts of money and there are individual issues between them. So they can't bring a representative action. And then you have in Alberta, there's a lot of householders who have put roofs on their houses made of this certain material called pine shakes, which turns out to be massively faulty and gets mold and lets in water and causes damage. And they all try and sue as a representative action. And the court says, well, no, you've all got different damages. You can't do that. So all across Canada, where in the 70s, there was a wave of enthusiasm for representative actions, then in the 80s and 90s, you get this sort of counter wave of, no, you can't do that. You can't address your rights through the form of a representative action. And for many people, that meant they couldn't have recourse for a breach of their rights at all. And so, sorry, I always do this. I talk and then my slides don't catch up. So then there was this general feeling that the legal system wasn't keeping up with the realities of modern life, where there's mass production, where the wrongdoing of one can injure many. There was a general feeling of injustice that all these people had a cause of action. They had something to sue for, but they couldn't actually sue because the procedure wasn't there. And everyone says, well, it's just a rule. Why do we have these stupid technicalities that are standing in our way? And of course, if you look back to the beginning of the presentation, they're not stupid technicalities. They actually go to the fundamental purpose of what these different procedures are. But at that time, this wasn't well researched. This wasn't well thought out. And people just saw technicalities standing in their way. Anyway, and they had a right to want to be able to bring a lawsuit for what had been done to them. The procedure wasn't there. So how did Canada react? Well, then across Canada, you start getting provincial legislatures, and Canada has 10 different provinces. So, and they all enact their own legislation for this kind of thing. So you get the different provinces enacting class actions legislation, saying the representative action rule is old, it's garbage, it's got all these technicalities standing in the way. Let's enact legislation so people can bring collective litigation, even if they have individual issues between them. And so that's what happens. They start saying, well, the representative action has all these weird technicalities. Let's get rid of those and let's put in the class action. And because they didn't see the weird technicalities as something that actually went to the very reason why you would bring the action in the first place, that sort of meant that the issues that arising in class actions, nobody knew why they arose. But they actually arose because they were different from this previous representative action. And the reasons that representative actions had the identity they did is because if you ignored them, you would get all these issues arising. And so what were those kinds of issues? Well, first of all, the modern class action that a lot of these provinces enacted said, well, everyone's involved who was affected by the wrong. So, for example, there's a defective pharmaceutical drug. Everyone who took that defective pharmaceutical drug is in the action unless they decide to opt out. That's what an opt-out class is. And that's fine if you're bringing the action as a group and it's a group identity and the group rights are not severable from each other. So if they're indivisible rights, that's fine. But if you're bringing an action, for example, for your roof falling in, or for your car being dodgy, or for your insurance policy going kaput and you losing a lot of money, that's different. You're not part of a group identity anymore, and the rights are divisible. So someone is litigating on your behalf, you're in this class, you're affected, some representative is litigating on your behalf and you might not even know it. And that's problematic from a sort of modern day procedural justice standpoint. So that's one of the problems they had. The next one was what's called aggregate damages. So I mentioned earlier that representative actions were brought as a group, and the group identity is the same, and the group remedy is usually the same. We have a right to graze on your land, the end. But if you're suing for damages, that still might work if all the damages are the same, because then they can give a big bunch of money to the group and say, just, you know, divide up amongst yourselves, and that's fine. But if you've got this sort of this handful of claims and they're all different, and then you give all those people a sum of damages, how are you going to know how to divide it up amongst them? How are you going to divide it accurately? Are you going to give some people more money and others less money? They all have different interests in the action. So how can you all give the group one big lump of money and expect it to be divided up accurately? So that was a problem too. And then the third one, this is a really weird innovation of modern class actions, CPRE distributions. And this is taken from trust law, where normally if someone dies and leaves a charity some money in their will, and then it comes to dividing up the estate and the charity no longer exists, or the money can't go there for some reason, then they'll give it to a charity that's as close as possible to the original charity, so that the person who made the will, their intention doesn't fail. So, you know, I'm leaving it to the NSPCC, the NSPCC doesn't exist anymore, fine, we'll give it to Childline or something like that. So that's originally what CPRE was about. But in class actions, what CPRE is where a big lump of money has been given to a class in the form of aggregate damages. Not everyone makes a claim, so you have money left over. And so normally that means that money should go back to the defendant, because you've compensated everyone you can out of the class. And if the others don't want to make a claim, then that's up to them. You've got to do something with the money. So normally you would just give it back to the defendant, but people started to say, well, that's sort of giving the defendant a windfall. They did something wrong, they should have to pay for it. And so instead of just giving it back to the defendant, we should make sure that the money goes to something as close as possible to compensating the people who were wronged. So you give it to a bunch of cancer patients were wronged, you give it to a cancer charity, that kind of thing. And that's really anathema to a lot of the principles of modern civil litigation. So that was really controversial when class actions were being passed in Canada, in the provinces. And it didn't help either that there were all these misunderstandings about what class actions actually did, and mixing them up with representative actions and what I mentioned at the beginning, the group litigation where every individual has to sue. And that mistake is clear in the provincial debates on class action legislation, and also in the Supreme Court of Canada decision 20 years after Nakin, which is called Dutton, Western Canadian Shopping Centres in Dutton. So in 2001, the Supreme Court of Canada takes another look at class actions and says, and this is a case arising out of Alberta, which doesn't have class actions legislation yet. So it's a representative action that the Supreme Court of Canada is looking at. And they look at the representative action and they say, well, it's just like a class action, isn't it? I mean, what's the difference? Alberta's got this procedure. Why can't it have class actions? They're pretty much the same thing. Everywhere should have class actions. Class actions of Canada, yay! And that's essentially what they did. They considered group litigation and class actions and representative actions, and they said they were all essentially the same thing. And so the whole of Canada could have class actions. Now that's a massive simplification, but it is essentially what the Supreme Court of Canada did. And because the Supreme Court of Canada had decided this, all the provinces that didn't have class actions after that decision said, well, might as well have class actions now because the Supreme Court of Canada said we should. So the Supreme Court of Canada essentially changed the law in all the Canadian provinces, which was a pretty big deal. So then what? Well, then we get to England. You know, this is supposed to be a sort of transatlantic presentation. What happened to England? Why doesn't England have class actions? Why didn't the same course that happened in Canada happen in England? Well, one of the main reasons is England could tell the difference between representative actions and class actions. And it saw that enacting class actions was actually a huge step that would bring in all sorts of problems like the ones I mentioned. And they didn't want to, well, they couldn't leave that to the courts, and they wanted to have a proper consultation in the legislature before they brought any of that stuff in. So what happened in England? So if any of you were alive in the 1980s, probably not, it's probably just me, there were a lot of things that gave rise to multi-party actions in the 1980s. So when I say multi-party actions, that's sort of a predecessor to group litigation, where everyone brings their own claim and they just happen to be managed in the same court. And so multi-party actions, there were a lot of these in the 80s. There are sudden disasters like the Zeebrugge ferry disaster, which the ferry capsized and killed 200 people. That was a huge disaster, and there's a picture of it right there. It's one of the first things I remember seeing on the news. And then there were creeping disasters, which were, they're called creeping because they involve incidents that affect a wide group of people and can take place over a number of years. So if there's a defective pharmaceutical drug or a defective product and someone takes it, they'll get ill or they'll get injured, but that could happen in a number of different places at a number of different times, and the cause could be a number of different things. And so it's more of a kind of rolling, creeping phenomenon than a sudden plane crash, ferry capsize, football ground overcrowding. Those are the sudden disasters. The creeping disasters are different. And so because the sudden disasters liability, who's at fault, is much clearer, right? So in the Zeebrugge ferry disaster, somebody left the cargo, the bow doors open, and that caused the capsizing. So it's quite obvious who's at fault there. It's the ferry company. Hillsborough, it's less obvious who's at fault, I guess, but you know, it was probably the football ground, right? So it's quite clear who's at fault in these cases. If there's an airplane crash and it's a mechanical failure, that's going to be the manufacturer of the plane or the airline or something like that. So those things didn't get into court so much. It was more the creeping disasters where there were really procedural problems in how to manage all the different claims, how to share costs amongst all the different people they're all litigating the same question, you know, is this drug defective? I mean, they're all litigating the same question. So should they share the costs? I don't know. How do you do that? How do you manage things like pleadings? When you make a claim in court, you have to, now you have to fill in a claim form and, you know, submit it to the court. Well, do they all have to do the claim form in exactly the same level of detail? What's the point in 1,000 people writing exactly the same thing in their claim form, but they all happen to have, you know, one's got 10 pounds of damages and another's got 30 pounds and another's got 50 pounds. But what's the point of going over and over and over the same facts again? So is there some way that you can streamline that? How do you manage the cases so that you don't have to answer the same question 1,000 different times? Can you answer one question and then maybe, and it's that same kind of bifurcation, the splitting of the case. If you have one question on liability and the rest is just on damages, what the effect of the wrongdoing was, then maybe you can split it up so you answer one question here and 1,000 questions here. So there's all these different issues about how you manage all this mass litigation, these multi-party actions that are coming up. And this was a huge question in the 80s and 90s. But it's interesting that hardly ever did somebody say, well, why don't we do it as a representative action? And if you remember the sort of schematic that I raised at the beginning with the 3 types of diamonds, you'll see why. Because a representative action is where a group has a pre-existing identity and they sue as a group for relief that is given to them as a group. Whereas people who just happen to have been on the same plane or happen to have been on the same ferry or in the same football ground, the only thing that's linking them is what the defendant did wrong. They have no group identity other than that. So they don't really fit into a representative action. So then why didn't England just have class actions? I mean, they had that in Canada, right? Why didn't England have it? Well, there's a few different answers to that question. First of all, there was quite an anti-American sentiment that pushed back against things like huge jury awards, massive damages being awarded to the class. You know, you saw nowadays, you see billions being awarded in America, and lawyers in England didn't really want to have anything to do with that. They didn't want the abuses that they had seen in the States to come to England. And so they sort of threw the baby out with the bathwater. And as I said, class actions were another thing altogether, and it would take a huge debate and a huge, they would have to put it through the legislature to decide to have class actions. And they didn't want to take that step. It was a big step. So, and you had different reports debating whether there should be class actions. So you get the National Consumer Council, and they represent consumers, and that's sort of the archetypal class action. So you'd have thought they would have been all for it. But they said, well, it might work for small consumer claims where each claim is really similar, and so you can sort of group them all together quite easily, but not in the plane crashes and not in the defective drug cases and things like that, because everyone's too different. You can't really put them together as a class. So even the consumer side was saying, no, we don't really want widespread class actions, maybe just in this one sector. And then the Law Society had a report called Group Actions Made Easier, which talked about group litigation. And they were saying, well, we should have a procedure for, you know, having all these cases managed together, because there are common questions, but they're not exactly the same. So we can't have representative actions, and we don't want class actions. So we should have some procedure where they're just all managed in a group, but everyone still has to bring their own claim. And so then along comes Lord Woolf, and he does a sort of overarching view of the civil justice system generally. And so he looks at everything, not just multi-party actions, he looks at everything. Part of his work, though, is looking at multi-party actions. And so he says, well, yeah, you can't do it under the representative action rule. It's completely unsuitable. So I'm going to recommend this thing called a multi-party situation, which only Lord Woolf ever uses that term, and no one really takes him up on it. But he says, let's have a multi-party situation where you have all these claims and they're brought together. And you can either have that on an opt-in basis where everyone has to sue individually, or you can have it on an opt-out basis, which is more like a class action in America or Canada. And because this kind of opt-out recommendation was a bit of an afterthought and wasn't really, other legal groups, as I mentioned, weren't really in favor of it, that kind of got left on the sidelines. And so really only his opt-in approach was taken up. And what happened in the end is what we now call group litigation orders, where, as I said at the beginning, everyone brings their own claim, everyone brings their own lawsuit, and they're just managed together. So it's sort of an opt-in. Everyone has to take a step to become involved in the litigation. They have to bring their own claim, and all their claims are managed together. And the claims have to have common or related issues of fact or law. And that's now in the civil procedure rules in 1910. So they're directly related to their predecessors, the multi-party actions of the 80s and 90s, but they're not a class action in any way, shape, or form. And they're also not a representative action. The representative action continues to exist in the rules as a different procedure. And the same interest test continues now in England under CPR 19.6. And it's still being interpreted fairly restrictively. There's some change recently with the Lloyd and Google privacy case, and we'll be looking at that a little later. Let me just check the time to make sure that we're doing okay. Oh, now it's stopped the screen sharing. Okay, so I'm going to get back to the screen sharing just 1 second. Right, share. Okay, so So then what, England and Canada are obviously have two completely different approaches to collective litigation. Why am I saying that this is a transatlantic effort and two sides of the same ocean, blah, blah, blah? Isn't it just two different history lessons that I'm talking about? Well, no, because England does eventually join the party. So after group litigation becomes a thing under the group litigation order framework, England starts looking at class actions generally. So think back to the picture of the diamond, right? You've got the representative action is the big diamond. Then you've got the group litigation, which are the diamonds that are, they can stand on their own, they're quite sizable. And then you've got the class action, which is a bunch of tiny, tiny diamonds that really aren't worth anything in themselves. And so after the group litigation framework came along in England, group litigation was fine, representative actions were taken care of, but there were still these negligible claims, individually negligible claims that needed to be dealt with. So consumer claims where everyone lost £10, or financial services claims where everyone is £20 out of pocket. All these tiny little claims that no one would ever sue for individually, they're still out of luck in England after the group litigation framework comes into play in 2000. And so England starts looking at how you can get justice for these different claims. And so the Civil Justice Council releases a report and says that we should have US style class actions. Well, they base it more on Canada, but we should have North American style class actions. That's what they say. And the government sort of comes back and says, well, yeah, but no. I mean, they're really wary about US style class actions. They don't really want to have much to do with it, but they said, well, we'll try it sector by sector. We'll try it in one sector first and see if it works. And so, and the first candidate is financial services claims, because right now we're about 2008, 2009, and the financial crisis has hit England's shores. So there are lots of claims against banks. And so they say, well, why don't we have class actions in financial services? And that way all these small claims can have recourse. Unfortunately, it didn't get very far because there was a class actions provision in the Financial Services Act 2010, and then the general election hit, and the class actions provision was too controversial to pass before the election. So they decided to just get rid of it so they could pass the act. So the FSA passed with no class action provision in it at all. Okay, so then they try again. Then they start talking about, well, maybe we should have class actions in competition law. Competition law is things like price fixing, that kind of thing, where companies collude to raise the price of a certain product, and that hurts the end consumers because they have to pay more for it. That's just one example of a case you bring in competition law. So previously, between 2000 and 2010, competition law actions were opt-in. Everyone had to bring their own action. Well, that was a bit useless because the damages in competition law individually are so small that it's like the little tiny diamonds that I showed you for class actions. They don't stand alone on their own. Nobody's going to bother doing anything about that tiny speck. So class action, opt-in actions, in competition law really didn't get very far. And so then the Office of Fair Trading starts saying, well, maybe we should have opt-out class actions in competition law. And they start that discussion in about 2007. In the meantime, you've got the European Commission talking about what they call collective redress. So Europe is even more anti-US style class actions than England is. And they start talking about having this framework in competition law, but they do not want it to be opt-out. They don't want it to be class actions. They are absolutely dead set against class actions. And so the EC sort of dithers around for a few years and says, well, we've got this new deal for consumers, we've got this recommendation, we've got that, blah, 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 blah. And they were going to have a directive, but then there was a huge pushback, and then they decided on a recommendation, and all this stuff is going on in Europe, and England looks across the channel and says, so this for game of monkeys, let's have our own legislation. Let's just do this. And so, obviously I'm simplifying hugely, but And so in 2015, they pass the Consumer Rights Act. So the Consumer Rights Act amends the Competition Act so we can have class actions in competition law. So it's this one small sector of the economy where we have actual North American style class actions, where everyone is included in the class unless they opt out, where you can sue for damages, where you don't have to have any same interest or anything like that. There are things called common questions, but it's not as strict as the same interest test. So where common questions arise between this group that's been damaged, you can have a class action in England in competition law. Great. How does it go? Well, it doesn't start off very well. So one of the first class actions is to do with mobility scooters, I think, and that went by the wayside. And then the second one was to do with MasterCard. So MasterCard fixes what are called merchant interchange fees, and that drives up the price of everything in a shop that takes MasterCard. So even if the person doesn't pay with MasterCard, they're paying more because the fees are higher, so the merchant has to make the cost of the goods higher. And so everyone who is, I think the class is everyone who has ever used MasterCard between certain dates. So there's a lot of people in the class. You're probably in the class. So this is a class action that went to the Competition Appeal Tribunal at first instance. And the Competition Appeal Tribunal said, well, there are a lot of people in this class. They all have different damages. They all bought things at different dates. And there's really no way that you can calculate on a group basis what their damages are. You'd have to go to each single individual person in the class, find out what their damages are, add that up, and then you've got your damages. And there's no way you can do that. So this bottom-up approach is impossible. So you can't have the class action, sorry. And so then the claimants go to the Court of Appeal. And the Court of Appeal says, whoa, whoa, whoa. Honestly, if you had to figure out every single person's damages before you could bring a class action, there's no way you would ever bring a class action. That would totally go against the spirit of the legislation that Parliament passed. So we say that there's a way where you can look at the class as a whole, and this is like the aggregate damages that I mentioned earlier. You look at the class as a whole and say, well, you can estimate roughly what their damages are, and that's how the class action could go ahead. And so the Court of Appeal said, yeah, go ahead, it's a class action. Cue party by all the claimant firms. And so now that's gone to the Supreme Court of Canada, and the hearing was last week, and everyone's waiting to see what the Supreme Court of the UK, not Supreme Court of Canada. So it's gone to the UK Supreme Court, and we're waiting on their decision, which probably won't come out for about 6 months. So in making its decision, the Court of Appeal, another very interesting thing is the Court of Appeal looked across the Atlantic, and this is where you get the link with Canada. The Court of Appeal looked across the Atlantic and said, look at Canada. Canada's done amazing things with class actions. Canada has kept the evidentiary burden, the evidence that you have to bring to start up a class action. They've kept that burden very low. They've made it so that people can bring class actions and get recourse for these small money claims, these small damages. And we should be doing the same. And so a big part of the Court of Appeal's judgment is looking at jurisprudence from Canada and saying, how have they done it? And it's really interesting that they've relied on Canada in that way. And a lot of the sort of class action reformers in the UK have looked across at Canada and said, what are they doing? So Canada is sort of becoming a beacon for England. And the Court of Appeal said, they looked at this trilogy from the Supreme Court of Canada in 2013 and analyzed it very closely and said the Canadian jurisprudence informs the correct approach. And that decision actually came out about a year after I started my DPhil, and I cheered heartily because it sort of gave justification to what I was doing.
Susie, I'm really sorry. I have to be the resident time custodian here.
No, that's great. Thank you.
To wrap up.
Yes. So the future. I've only got one more slide. Yeah. So what is the future? Are we going to have class actions in England outside of competition law? I think unlikely. I think generic, in every single sector, class actions is unlikely. However, MasterCard and Lloyd both show promise. Like I said, we had the MasterCard Supreme Court hearing last week. in the UK, and I think that they're going to uphold the Court of Appeal's decision to let the class action proceed. And I mentioned earlier the privacy representative action against Google, Lloyd and Google. And in that case, there was a data breach, and everyone in the representative action was basically suing for the invasion of their privacy and the data breach that Google deliberately undertook. And the representative action was allowed to proceed at the Court of Appeal, which is quite revolutionary, given that there was no pre-existing group identity. So it's not a traditional representative action, but it was still allowed to proceed. And so I think if the Supreme Court upholds that Court of Appeal decision, then we will probably have class actions in the data protection privacy area as well. But I think that's probably going to be done by legislation. They're not just going to let the representative action proceed and open the floodgates. They're going to say, no, we want to keep it to this one area. So we're going to have some kind of data protection legislation that allows for class actions for breaches of data protection. So I think it's going to spread beyond the competition sector to data protection and possibly to consumer claims, but it's not going to be a sort of widespread free-for-all like it's been in Canada, where you can bring a class action for anything. Okay, and then questions. That is the end of my presentation, and I will stop the screen share.
Excellent, thank you very much. Feel free to unmute yourselves, and let's have a round of applause for Suzanne.
Yay.
Excellent, yeah, so what we're going to do is first have some questions for Suzanne, and then after that we'll open the floor up to questions for any of our speakers. Yeah, so does anybody have any questions?
There's some in the chat. JC said, time. Sorry, didn't see that.
Is that a question?
Can I ask a quick question?
Yes, Aidan. Yeah, hi.
My complete ignorance on these things here, actually, so it's a really kind of basic question. But I'm wondering, in those class actions where you've got potentially loads and loads of very, very small claims, tiny amounts, in whose interest is it to organise the whole thing and bring the action? Who kind of orchestrates the whole thing?
Yeah, so that's a really important question, because you've got this, everyone's got small claims, and so nobody's going to be bothered to step forward unless you incentivize people. And so that's another thing that the Court of Appeal in England looked at with the MasterCard class action. They said, you know, one of the reasons to bring all these claims together is to make them financially viable. And then if you make them financially viable, then lawyers and third-party funders, and some people are going to have red flags go up at this point, lawyers and third-party funders are going to have an interest in bringing the action, because the third-party funders especially are going to have a commercial interest in funding the action. And so they work together with the lawyers to bring the action, and ideally you would also have an interested representative. And England has done very well on this point so far. The people who've been representative plaintiffs have kind of a community service ethos. So you've had an ex-financial ombudsman, or maybe a pensions ombudsman, bringing the MasterCard class action. You've got other people who are previous heads of which, the Consumer Protection Council, that kind of thing. So you've got people who are well known, have a community service ethos, and obviously bringing the class actions in the interests of all these people who are in the group. How it will work, because in Canada you have complete randoms bringing class actions, and sometimes they're not always the most noble class actions. And so I don't know if that problem is going to hit England in the future, but right now they're doing really well. So, yeah. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you. Thank you.
Okay, great.
Well, maybe we do have some direct questions to Susie, but in the interest of the curiosity you might have about the other speakers, we'd like to open the floor to questions about anything and anyone who is still in the room. Matthew, are you still with us?
Yep. Hello.
Well,
Oh, there you are.
I've got family barbecue coming up soon, but I can I can answer some questions. Or not, but I don't mind.
No question is too stupid.
Oh,
So just because
Nathan?
you're.
I think Nathan's got a blue hand.
Yes, I do. Oh, can you guys
Caught blue-handed.
see
There you are.
and hear me?
Yep.
Hi. Hey. I had a, thank you all very much for your lovely talks. I had a question for Matt. So in Christian theology, we're generally understood to be the only creatures born in the image and likeness of God, or created in the image and likeness of God. And that has frequently led philosophers to tie this image bearing to rationality. Because we're the rational animal, we're the ones made in the image and likeness of God. So that's what it is to be made in God's likeness, is to be rational, or so some say. I wondered what you thought about that, because if you did think it was tied to rationality, then someone like Ray might be able to bite the bullet and say, well, yeah, I mean, those that have more rationality participate more in the image. And of course, that's like a morally repugnant conclusion, but it's one you see all the time in philosophy: denial of personhood to the disabled or the unborn or whatever. So it's certainly a move commonly made.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So the first part of that, actually, I'm not entirely sure that's always true. I mean, Aquinas and other scholastics often said things like that everything is made in the image of God, but to varying different sort of degrees. So a leaf still has a sort of divine image, but it's a very different sort of image, or it holds the image to a lesser extent. So there's difference in kind, some say, difference in extent, others say. So that's the scholastics. Yeah, with the rationality thing, I think that's an interesting move. There's another move you can make, which is to say something like, well, all it is to be a divine image holder of the relevant sort is to say have a soul. In which case, you're going to still say something like the mentally able and the mentally disabled are made equally in the image of God, because they both hold souls, unless you can come up with some sort of account as to why someone who's mentally disabled, even to an extraordinarily a worrying or difficult or whatever degree, unless you can say that person doesn't have a soul, or maybe isn't a person or whatever, then you're going to include the masculine, the feminine, the able, the disabled, and you can probably still then make distinctions as to what it's better to be. So the problem, I think, that probably underlies a lot of the difficulty with Rare's paper is that he takes the Imago Dei doctrine to entail the equality thesis, which is that it is not better to be one than the other. But that doesn't seem to me to hold in the absence of other assumptions, because you could imagine that, all it is to bear the divine image is just to have a soul. Why then do I have to think that that all and sundry are equal? I don't, unless you have some other assumptions as well. Yep, good.
Do we have a question?
Any more questions?
Barbara?
Yeah, so thank you all very much for your talk. So apologies, I can't help indulging. So Matthew, I have a question. So I'm curious, I initially wanted to ask you precisely what it was. So what you've given us, if you're right, is a reductio argument that's supposed to show that something's wrong with Ray's argument, right? Yeah. And so what I wanted to ask you was what specifically did you think was wrong with it? And you partially answered that question now by saying it's something to do with this equality doctrine. But now I want to maybe give you an opportunity to say a little bit more about this, precisely because in explaining the equality doctrine, you say, for example, that part of the question here is about whether having certain kinds of divine attributes or just having certain attributes at all would be better than others, right? But what kind of betterness or what kind of value is at issue here seems salient to what kind of features we might think this kind of claim that Ray wants to make and the kind of argument that he's trying to run may or may not work. So I'm wondering, maybe if you could say a little bit more perhaps about either how Ray's understanding this and how, we think we should understand the kind of value that's at hand here.
Yeah, so in short, and I'll give the long. In short, I'm not entirely sure where this goes wrong. I think that's partly the sort of interest of the paper. I mean, if we take the claim in the first way, which I will find it somewhere or other. Okay, so if we take the claim, if an attribute A is essential to all persons of the Trinity, then intrinsically it is better to be A than not to be A. Well, this seems to sort of work with certain things like, masculinity, femininity, but it just doesn't work with things like with mentally disabled and mentally abled. And yeah, the value thing here is interesting because is it moral value? Is it prudential value? Is it sort of aesthetic value maybe? Is it a different sort of sui generis value? Maybe you could include all of them and think like all sort of values. If you sort of all values considered, this thing is better than that thing. The only question there is you might end up with problems. So you might end up with something like, oh, there's like an aesthetic value here is great, but maybe the prudential or well-being value is so low as a result of that. I mean, grant for a second that, let's say, I don't know, it's better to be, for aesthetic value, let's just say that it's better to be really, really slim and skinny. Well, maybe this gives you really bad well-being value. And so you're going to have some interesting calculus as to say like what sort of value, not just like which values are important, but how they play into each other. And if you have value 10 of aesthetic value, does that assume lexical priority? Does it not? So the value question is fascinating, but extremely complicated. And it's really not clear what Rare thinks by it. He generally goes on just the assumption that, of course, it's not better to be masculine or feminine, and that's the assumption he goes on, and he takes it as read that he doesn't have to demonstrate this. But of course, when you plug in certain things like mentally disabled, mentally able, and these sorts of counterexamples, you start to think, you really do need to do a lot of work here as to say like why it works in some senses. It works in a dialectic just to assume that it's neither better nor worse to be masculine or feminine, but then you can see why perfect being theism just delivers you these like nice, simple, like straight off the bat kind of things. But it's much more complicated if you think like, well, hang on, like why is this assumption here? What sort of value is delivering? So yeah, it's a very complicated area, that, and I haven't really answered your question, partly because I don't know. But I hope I've sort of mapped out the various sort of things you could say. Another one possibly was something like you might not just think in terms of values that are relevant for humans, but you might think there were like relational values as well. And so you might think like, oh, maybe it's the case that a relationship with God is strengthened if you happen to have a sort of certain mindset. You happen to have a certain sort of mental behavioral pattern or whatever. You're more likely to have a stronger relationship with the one. Maybe this is an important thing, and maybe it's the case that men are better than that, or women are better at that, or maybe this you should sort of try to manifest these sorts of things. Another thing you could think like, well, maybe it's better. There's like a strong. It's not so. Maybe let's say that women are better, all things considered, better to be a woman than it is to be a man. That doesn't sound that implausible to me either. And with that, you could think like, okay, well, this doesn't matter then for things like divine grace or whatever, because what matters is, let's say you're like there. So women are here, men are there in terms of like what it's better to be. Well, what really matters for things like, I don't know, pleasing God is how far you get. So if a woman's here but only goes up that much, but the man goes like, whoa, I've pleased God this much, then that's great. So even if it's all things considered better to be one than the other, that doesn't mean that you don't please God to a good extent. Anyway, there you are.
No, thank you.
sorry, I've got to go to have a barbecue now. I'm sorry, sorry, but thank you all like very much for things, and like private message me if you'd like to talk about things or not. But thank you.
Well, thank you for being with us.
Cheers. Thank you.
Yeah, why don't we have a round of applause for all of our speakers before Collier nips off?
Okay. Okay. Cheers, chaps. Cheers. Bye. Later.
Thank you. Are there any more questions for Susie before we wrap up?
Has Neil stepped out of the, has he left the building?
I think so, yeah. You're holding the fort.
Yeah.
If not, last chance? No, okay. Well, yeah, thanks again. It was great to get together and hear 3 fantastic talks. Yeah. That's all, folks.
I'm sorry.
Oh, do we?
Yeah, I have a little question. I'm sorry
Sure.
to take your time. And it's my first time to join the Oriel Talk. It's very, very nice. And thank you for the terrific speakers. And I learned so much. And my little question is to Suzanne. And as far as I know, according to the civil procedure laws of China, if one or both parties are 2 or more persons and the object of the action is common, or if the object of the action is of the same kind and the people's court considers that it can try jointly with the consent of the parties, it shall be a joint action. So my question is there any difference if a party to joint action has common rights or they are not common rights in Canada? I don't know about this. Yeah.
So when you say common rights, do you mean what I was referring to earlier with the group rights of a representative action, or is that what you're referring to?
Yeah, common action.
Yeah. So there's, and this is where a lot of the confusion arises. So there's in a class action you can have the group rights. They're litigating as a group, and the remedy that they have is going to be applicable to them as a group. So it's the indivisible rights that I was talking about before, the big diamond. That you can have that in a representative action or a class action. And so the class actions have morphed to sort of engulf all these other different types of procedures, unfortunately. But or you can have group rights. You can have group rights, or you can have rights that are collective. Like there's a group of people and they all have some kind of right against the defendant, but the right might be slightly different. And you can have in Canada a class action for those as well. So does that answer your question, or sorry?
Yeah, it's nice. Yeah, got it.
Okay,
yeah.
Great, good. Yeah. Thank you for the question.
It looks a lot like there aren't any more questions left. But thank you very much to our wonderful speaker and 2 speakers in absentia. Thank you
in Spade for organizing. I think it's a round of applause for you guys doing it, especially in these circumstances.
Yes.
So well done. Thank you.
And we're thanking everyone. So thank you for allowing us to go weirdly smoothly. There was no glitch of any kind. No one's children ran into the room. So thank you very much for being with us tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you.